Fire climbs a hillside in the dark. Not wildfire, set fire. Deliberate hungry eating through stacked cords of oak like something starving that finally got fed. A girl stands frozen at the edge of it, one bucket in her hand, one bucket against an inferno the size of a barn. Behind her up the slope, something waits in the dark that the flames haven't found yet. Something with a name carved into stone. Something 30 years in the making. Because the fire isn't the real danger tonight. The fire is a warning. Somewhere down that mountain, a truck engine is already turning over headlights, cutting through smoke. A man behind the wheel who believes this land, this mountain, this secret belongs to him now. He is wrong, but she doesn't know that yet. Not standing here, not with the flames climbing higher, and the cold and the sound of boots on gravel getting closer behind her. All she knows is this. Somebody wants what's buried in that hillside badly enough to burn it to the ground rather than let her keep it. Sister Agatha called it a blessing. She called it that with a straight face. No smile, no warmth, just those thin lips moving around a word that didn't belong in her mouth. A blessing, as if a girl with 2 dresses and a pair of borrowed shoes could hear that word and feel anything but the floor dropping out from under her. I was 16. I've been 16 for exactly 4 days. And I already knew the way you know a storm is coming before the sky even changes, that whatever came next was going to be worse than anything the Sisters of Mercy had thrown at me in 6 years. Because good news doesn't get read aloud in a dining hall. Because good news doesn't make 30 girls go quiet and then start laughing. She read it anyway, stood at the head of that long table with the letter trembling slightly in her hand, not from emotion, from age, and read every word like she was reading a grocery list. 14 acres, steep hillside, a dwelling in disrepair, and then almost as an afterthought, something about a rock formation. Inaccessible. Overgrown. The laughing started before she even finished. Betsy Coyle laughed the loudest. She always did. And I sat there with my hands flat on the table and I did not cry. Because I'd stopped crying at 12. Because tears in that place were a currency nobody would trade for anything. My name is Ruthie Ann Sutton, and this is the story of what I found behind decades of vines. What was hiding in a mountain nobody in Boone County would even look at straight on. They called it cursed. They were wrong. Or no, not wrong exactly. Just early. My mother died when I was 10. Scarlet fever. Fast, the doctor said. Like that was supposed to be a comfort. Like fast was some kind of mercy. My father was already gone by then. Boone County coal miner, walked into a mountain one October morning in 1932 and never walked back out. They found his lamp. Still lit, if you can believe that. Still burning when they pulled it from the rubble 3 days later. They never found him. So there wasn't a body to bury, just a lamp. Just a hole in the ground where a man used to be, and a hole in a family where a father used to be, and eventually a hole in me where a mother used to be too. No aunts, no uncles. Nobody stepped forward. The state stepped forward instead, which is its own kind of joke if you think about it long enough. The state doesn't love anybody. The state just keeps records. 6 years at Sisters of Mercy in Charleston. 6 years of laundry lines and Bible verses, and a woman named Sister Constance who slapped me once for watching a vine climb a fence post instead of scrubbing a floor. I still don't regret watching that vine. I regret the slap, not the watching. Because that's the thing nobody understood about me. I didn't want to be difficult. I just wanted to know why things grew the way they grew. Why a plant reached for light like it was starving for it. Why roots went down before anything ever went up. Sister Agatha called it foolishness. I called it the only thing that ever made sense to me in a world that mostly didn't. The lawyer's name was Hargrove. He was a round man, tobacco-stained fingers, a truck that smelled like dog and engine oil, and something else underneath that I couldn't place until later, fear maybe. Old fear, the kind that soaks into upholstery and never fully leaves. He picked me up outside the home with my cloth bag and my 2 dresses and my shoes that pinched at the heel, and he didn't say much for the first 10 miles. Then he said, "Your grandmother was a particular woman." I looked at him. Particular how? Kept to herself. He didn't look over. Kept his eyes on the road, which was really just two ruts cut into red dirt. 40 years up in that hollow. People left her be. Did you know her? Knew of her? A pause, long enough that I noticed it. Everybody up here knew of her, not the same as knowing her. I let that sit for a mile or two. The truck rattled. The mountains got taller, greener, closer somehow, like they were leaning in to listen. Mr. Hargrove. Why didn't anybody buy the land if she never used it? If it was just sitting there? And here is where his hands tightened on the wheel. Just slightly. Just enough that I saw it. Somebody tried, he said, who doesn't matter now. Except it did matter. Because a man doesn't grip a steering wheel like that over nothing. Because his jaw went tight and his eyes flicked to the mirror like he expected somebody to be following us out here on a dirt road in the middle of nowhere. "Mr. Hargrove, company fella," he said finally, fast like he wanted it out of his mouth and gone. "Cool outfit out of Logan. Man named Otis Draper. Came around 3-4 times over the years. Wanted to buy the mineral rights under your grandmother's land." And she said no. She said no the first time real polite. Hargrove's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile. Said no the last time with a shotgun. I laughed. I couldn't help it. First laugh I'd had in longer than I wanted to admit. But Hargrove didn't laugh with me. "Draper's still around," he said. "Still interested. You ought to know that. Before you go signing anything. Before you go trusting anybody who shows up smiling." I didn't understand yet. Couldn't have. Because I didn't know what was hiding on that hillside. Didn't know there was anything worth a coal company's attention beyond dirt and rock, and whatever black seam ran underneath it. I thought he meant the land. He meant something else. Something bigger. Something that hadn't been born yet in my mind, not until I saw it with my own eyes 3 days later, standing in a clearing with my mouth hanging open like a fool. But that's later. First there was the cabin. First there was the walking in alone. He dropped me at the mouth of a path that barely deserved the name. Rhododendron closed in from both sides, thick enough to make a tunnel dark enough that the afternoon light barely made it through. He handed me a key, an old iron thing heavier than it looked. He handed me $5 folded twice soft at the creases like it had been carried a long time. "Cabin's a 1/4 mile up," he said. "I've never been past it. Don't know anybody who has. Not in years." "What's past it?" He looked at me then. Really looked. And something crossed his face that I couldn't name at 16, but I can name now all these years later. Pity. And underneath the pity, something closer to awe. Like he suspected something and didn't have the nerve to say it out loud. "Rock formation," he said. "That's what the paperwork calls it. Overgrown a long time ago. Nobody's been near it in..." He stopped. Started again. "Just be careful up there, Miss Sutton." Careful of what I wanted to ask. But he was already back in the truck, already turning around in a spot barely wide enough for it. And I stood there with a key in one hand and $5 in the other, and my whole life packed into a bag I could carry with one arm, and I thought, this is either the beginning of something or the end of everything. There wasn't a middle. There never is at 16. Everything feels like the edge of a cliff. I started walking. The cabin wasn't much. One room, plank floor swollen with damp, a stone fireplace cold, a roof that sagged in the middle, but hadn't given up entirely. Small mercies, I was learning, came in shapes like that. But the books, Lord, the books, not novels, not scripture, though there was a worn Bible on the shelf, too spine cracked from use. These were books on soil, on roots, on something called mycology that I couldn't even pronounce the first time I read it out loud to the empty room. Hand-drawn diagrams pinned to the walls, cross-sections of root systems, Careful little notes in the margins, sun exposure here, water table there, depth of limestone measured in feet and inches, like she'd walked every inch of that hillside with a measuring tape and a devotion I didn't have a word for yet, and on the table. Like she'd just stepped away from it, an open journal, the last entry. Handwriting that shook age maybe, or something closer to the end than age, but still careful, still deliberate. It said if the girl comes, she must clear the door. She must see what I built. The vines are only sleeping. What's behind them is the answer. I read it 3 times. Then I sat down at that table, pressed both palms flat against the wood the way you'd press your hands against something solid when the ground underneath you doesn't feel solid at all. And I breathed. Because a woman I never met had been waiting for me. A grandmother who died 3 months before I ever knew her name had left a message like a hand reaching up out of the dark. The door. What door? I looked around that cabin twice over before I understood. There wasn't a door inside those 4 walls that led anywhere but outside. She meant something bigger. She meant something I hadn't seen yet. It took me 2 full days just to find where to start looking. The hillside behind the cabin rose steep and sudden thick, with growth so dense that sunlight barely touched the ground beneath it. Kudzu had swallowed the lower slope in ropey green curtains. Wild grape wound through it like veins. Virginia creeper climbed whatever rock showed through and underneath all of it. Underneath decades of stubborn, patient, relentless growth, something waited. I didn't see it first. I felt it, a cold breath against my face. Not wind. Wind moves and changes and dies down. This didn't. This came steady and cool and constant, like a held breath finally being let out. I started pulling vines. My hands bled before the first hour was done. I didn't stop. Couldn't stop, not once that cold air touched my skin, because something in me, something underneath the tired, underneath the orphan, underneath the girl, nobody wanted recognized that breath. Recognized it like a voice calling my name. I worked until the light went gold, then gray, then gone. Slept on the cabin floor with my hands wrapped in torn cloth. Woke up and did it again. And on the third day, the light came through the canopy at an angle it hadn't managed before, because I'd finally cleared enough, finally cut deep enough into that green wall, and it hit stone. Not a hole, not a hillside. Stone, carved stone, rising higher than the trees around it, higher than anything I'd expected, higher than anything a person builds by accident. I stood there with the sickle still in my hand and my mouth open, and I thought, no, that's wrong. I didn't think anything. Thinking requires words, and for a long moment, I didn't have any, because what stood in front of me wasn't a cave. It was a church carved straight into the mountain itself. Stone walls rising up out of rock like the hillside had grown it from the inside out. A tower, an actual tower, narrow and tall, easily 25 meters, if it was an inch, with a peaked roof gone green with age and moss and years of neglect. Windows cut high into the stone arched at the top, the glass long gone cloudy or gone entirely black holes staring down at me like something ancient, deciding whether or not to wake up. And above a door so large it looked built for giants and not for people, a shape. Round, intricate, carved with a patience that made my chest hurt to look at. A window shaped like a flower. A rose. Vines had grown through it like green lace threaded through stone lattice. I stood there, and I stood there, and I could not make my legs move forward or backward, because nothing in my 16 years had prepared me for the sight of a cathedral rising out of a West Virginia hillside, like it had always been there, like the mountain had been holding its breath around it for years, waiting for somebody, anybody to come and let it exhale. I whispered, "What are you?" The mountain didn't answer. Mountains don't. But something in me already knew it was going to. I want to tell you, I ran straight for that door. I didn't. I sat down in the dirt right there, and I cried. First time since I was 12 years old. Not sad crying, not the kind that gets you nowhere. This was something else, something closer to a dam finally admitting it couldn't hold anymore. Because 6 years of being told I was nothing, 6 years of laundry lines and slapped hands, and a laugh in a dining hall that followed me all the way up a mountain in West Virginia. And here was a building bigger than the church I'd been dragged to every Sunday in Charleston. Bigger. Older looking somehow, though it couldn't have been more than a few decades since anybody laid the first stone. Built by a woman I never met. Left for a granddaughter she'd never held. I sat in that dirt, and I let myself feel every bit of it. Then I stood up, wiped my face with the back of a bleeding hand, and I went looking for a way in. It took 2 more days to clear the entrance enough to see the door proper. 2 more days of vines and blisters and a sickle that had gone dull from use. And somewhere in that time, I don't remember exactly when I stopped being afraid of the tower and started being afraid of something else entirely. Afraid of what would happen once the door actually opened. Because a building like that doesn't get built and then forgotten. Not by accident, not by a woman careful enough to leave hand-drawn diagrams pinned to cabin walls. Somebody built this on purpose, and somebody sealed it shut with the same purpose. Vines that thick don't grow by accident either. I found carved letters above the frame once I'd cleared enough. Chiseled deep into the stone the way you'd carve something meant to outlast you. M. Kincaid, 1912. My grandmother's name, the year she must have started. Below that smaller added later, the stone looked different there, newer somehow, like it had been carved decades after the first line. She built this so it would not be forgotten. I traced the letters with one finger. My hands shook doing it. Because whoever wrote that second line, and I would learn eventually exactly who meant every word of it as a promise. And promises like that don't get made for nothing. Ida Marsh found me on the 4th day. I didn't hear her coming. I was too deep in the vines, too deep in my own head. And when I turned around there, she was an older woman near 70, standing at the edge of the clearing with a jar of honey in one hand and an expression on her face like she was looking at a ghost. "You're the Kincaid girl," she said. Not a question. Ruthie Ann Sutton. I stood, brushed dirt off my knees. "I'm her granddaughter. I know who you are." Ida's eyes moved past me, up the stone walls, up to that green-capped tower, and something in her face changed, watching it softened and hardened at the same time, if that's even possible. "Mabel said you'd come. You knew her. Knew her most of my life." Ida's voice caught slightly on the word life. "She told me, years back, said she had a granddaughter in an orphanage down in Charleston, and one day that girl would come and finish what she started." I felt something cold move through my chest. Finish what? Ida didn't answer that. Not directly. "You been inside yet?" "No." "Good." She said it fast, firm. "Don't go in alone, not the first time." "Why not?" And here Ida Marsh, a woman I'd known all of 4 minutes, looked at me with an expression I would not understand fully until much, much later. "Because some things," she said, "you shouldn't have to face alone, not the first time. Not ever if you can help it." I wanted to ask more. She was already turning to leave that jar of honey still in her hand, like she'd forgotten why she brought it. "Mrs. Marsh," she stopped. "Somebody named Otis Draper," I said. "The lawyer mentioned him, said he wanted this land." Ida went very still. Still in a way that told me more than any words could have. Still like an animal that's heard a sound it recognizes and doesn't like. "He came around here again," she said. "Quiet now, quieter than before. 2 months back, before your grandmother passed. Asked after the property like he already knew she wasn't long for this world." "What did he want?" "Same thing he always wanted. Mineral rights. Coal outfit out of Logan County's been eyeing this hollow near 20 years. Her jaw tightened. "Your grandmother ran him off with a shotgun more than once. Last time he came, though, last time he didn't leave smiling. And he didn't leave empty-handed either." "What do you mean?" "I mean he took something with him when he left. Papers, maybe. I don't rightly know. But your grandmother wasn't the same after that visit. Started working faster. Started... Ida stopped herself, shook her head like she was shaking off a thought she didn't want to finish out loud. You be careful, girl. That man doesn't give up easy. And now that Mabel's gone... She didn't finish that sentence either. She didn't need to. That night I sat at my grandmother's table with the lantern burning low, and I read every page of that journal I could find. 6 of them. Eventually, though, I only had the one that first night, the one left open on the table, like she meant for me to read it first. Most of it was botany, soil notes, sketches of root systems that meant nothing to me yet, but would mean everything later. But near the back, near the last pages she ever wrote, the handwriting changed, got smaller, tighter, like she was trying to fit more truth into less space before she ran out of time to write it. One entry, dated only 6 weeks before she died, read, Draper came again today. He says the company owns rights older than my deed. Says there's papers somewhere proving it. I told him the same thing I have told him every time he has darkened this hollow. This land does not belong to men who dig. It belongs to what grows. He laughed at that. Men like him always laugh at things they cannot dig up and sell. I have hidden what matters. He will not find it. And if he comes back after I am gone, whoever finds this, whoever she is, she must know. The tower was never just stone. It was a promise. And promises outlast men like Otis Draper. They have to, because if they don't, everything I built here was for nothing. I read that passage 4 times. Then I closed the journal and I sat in the dark with the lantern guttering, and I thought about a shotgun and a coal company and a man who took something with him the last time he ever saw my grandmother alive. I thought whatever is behind that door, somebody wants it badly enough to wait years and watch an old woman die before trying again. I thought I am 16 years old and I'm alone in a hollow in the mountains, and there is a man out there who already believes this land is his. And I thought underneath all of it, quiet, stubborn, the same thing that made me watch vines climb fences instead of scrubbing floors. I am not leaving. Not now. Not after I've seen what's standing in that clearing. Not after reading what she wrote. Whatever she built. Whatever she hid. It's mine to finish now. I didn't sleep that night. Couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that rose window vines threaded through stone lace black glass, staring down at me like it was deciding something. So before dawn, I got up, lit the lantern, walked back up that path in the dark with my heart going faster than my feet. The tower looked different in the half-light before sunrise. Taller somehow. Or maybe I was just smaller, standing there at its base with nothing but a lantern and a key I didn't even know if it fit. I found the door itself finally clear of vines by mid-morning. Oak or something like it, gone silver gray with age, banded with iron, gone rusted but not rotted through. A ring for a handle big enough that I needed both hands to grip it. I put the iron key Hargrove gave me into the lock. It didn't turn, not at first. I had to work, it had to wiggle it against rust. And years of stillness, and just when I was ready to give up and go looking for another way in, it turned. The sound it made, that groan of old metal finally giving way, echoed up into the tower above me, like the building itself had been holding its breath and had finally let it out. I pushed. The door didn't move. I pushed again, shoulder against it. This time boots braced in the dirt, and slowly, so slowly, it felt like the mountain itself was deciding whether to let me. It gave. Cold air rushed out to meet me. The same cold breath I'd felt through the vines 4 days earlier, except now it wasn't hidden behind green curtains. Now it came straight at my face, carrying with it a smell I didn't have a name for yet. Earth. Something rich and dark and alive. Beyond the door, darkness. More darkness than a lantern could push back on its own. I stood on that threshold with my hands still on the door and my heart slamming against my ribs. And somewhere behind me, far down the path, I heard something. An engine. A truck coming up the dirt road toward the cabin. Slow. Deliberate. The kind of slow that isn't lost, isn't careful of the ruts. The kind of slow that belongs to somebody who already knows exactly where they're going. I turned, looked back down the hillside through the trees, and I saw it. Black dust covered a company name stenciled on the door that I couldn't read from that distance, but somehow already knew. Ida's warning came back to me all at once. Otis Draper doesn't give up easy. He was here, already. 4 days after I arrived. 4 days after I started clearing vines nobody was supposed to see me clearing. I looked at the open door behind me, at the darkness waiting inside a church my grandmother built stone by stone and then sealed shut like a secret worth keeping. I looked at the truck climbing the hollow closer now, close enough that I could hear gravel crunching under its tires. And I understood, standing there at 16 years old with dirt under my nails and blood dried into the creases of my palms, that whatever waited inside that tower, whatever my grandmother built and hid and died protecting, it was already worth more than Otis Draper's company could ever offer. And he already knew it too. I stepped inside, pulled the door until it stood open just wide enough for the truck's headlights when they reached the clearing to catch nothing but shadow. Whatever was coming for me, it was going to have to come through that door first. The dark inside that tower wasn't empty dark. It breathed. I stood just past the threshold with my lantern shaking in my hand, and behind me outside, I heard that truck roll to a stop at the mouth of the clearing. Heard a door slam. Heard boots on gravel. I didn't move. Because if I moved, the light would move. And if the light moved, whoever was out there would see it dancing through the dark like a held breath finally let go. So I stood still, pressed my back against cold stone, and listened. Miss Sutton. A man's voice. Easy. Too easy. The kind of easy that's been practiced in front of a mirror. I didn't answer. Miss Sutton, I know you're up here somewhere. Saw the smoke from your chimney a mile back. Still nothing from me. My heart going so hard I thought he might hear it through the door. Name's Otis Draper. A pause, boots shifting on gravel. I did business with your grandmother. Long time. Figured I'd pay my respects. And maybe talk a little business seeing as she's passed. Business. He said it soft. He said it kind. And underneath the kind something else, something with teeth. I raised my lantern, looked deeper into the tower behind me because whatever was in here, it was mine before it was his. Mine to see first. Mine to understand before some smiling stranger in a company truck got to decide what it was worth. The passage ran narrow for maybe 20 feet. Then it opened, and the light from my lantern hit ceiling and wall and floor all at once, and I forgot how to breathe. Mushrooms. Not a few, not a patch. Hundreds, thousands, maybe more than I could count in the time it took my mind to catch up with my eyes. They grew from logs stacked in careful rows along the floor oak and poplar, cut to the same length, arranged like soldiers standing at attention in the dark. They grew from shelves cut straight into the stone walls, packed with something dark and rich that smelled like the inside of the earth itself. They hung in pale clusters from wooden frames bolted into a ceiling that arched up so high my lantern light couldn't find the top of it. Gray and pearl and blue fanning out from log ends like something out of a dream nobody would believe if you told them. Brown caps in neat rows pushing through bark. White ones shaggy, tumbling down in waterfalls from the highest shelves. I stood there in that vast stone room, this cathedral my grandmother built, with her own 2 hands, and I understood finally fully what Ida Marsh meant. Some things you shouldn't have to face alone, because nobody should stand in the middle of a miracle by themselves. Not the first time, except I was alone. Because outside Otis Draper was still calling my name like a man who already believed the answer belonged to him. Miss Sutton. Closer now. He'd found the tower. I heard his boots on the stone step outside the door I'd left ajar. That's some building your grandmother put up. Surprised nobody in town ever mentioned it. I stepped back toward the entrance. Lantern low, voice steady or as steady as I could make it. Nobody in town's ever seen it. His shape filled the doorway then. Tall, hat pushed back. A face built for smiling at people right before he took something from them. Well, he looked past me, into the dark. into the shelves and the logs and the pale glowing clusters just barely catching lantern light. Something moved behind his eyes, surprise, maybe quickly swallowed. Now that is something. You should go, Mr. Draper. In a minute. He didn't move, didn't even blink. See, I came up here to talk about mineral rights. Companies had a claim filed on this hollow going back near 40 years, older than your grandmother's deed if the paperwork's read right. Then read it to me. I don't have it on me. Convenient. His smile flickered just slightly, and I understood in that flicker that Ida Marsh had been telling the truth. He doesn't give up easy. I'll be back, he said, with paper, and with men who know how to read it better than either of us. His eyes went past me one more time into that dark room full of pale, glowing life, and something in his expression made my skin go cold. Didn't expect to find a farm in a church, Miss Sutton. Makes a man wonder what else your grandmother was hiding up here. He turned, walked back toward his truck without another word. I stood in that doorway until the sound of his engine faded down the hollow, and only then did my legs remember how to shake. I didn't sleep well that first week. How could I? Because every creak of that tower sounded like a boot on stone. Because every gust of wind through the rose window sounded like an engine climbing the hollow. And because somewhere out there, a man with paperwork older than my grandmother's deed was deciding how much this mountain was worth to him. I threw myself into the only thing that made sense. The mushrooms. I read my grandmother's journals by lantern light until my eyes burned. Learned the words before I understood them. Mycelium, substrate, fruiting body. Learned that the mushrooms weren't separate things at all, that underneath the logs, underneath the shelves, ran a single vast network of threads, feeding everything, connecting everything patient in a way I didn't yet have the patience to understand. Feed the network, she'd written. And it feeds you. I fed it. Cut new logs from the forest around the cabin. Mixed substrate the way her diagrams showed. Watched day after day as things that looked half dead pushed new growth up through old wood, like they'd just been waiting for somebody to ask. Ida came by every few days, brought cornmeal, brought a wool blanket she swore she didn't need. Never once hugged me, but she showed up. And in that hollow, showing up meant more than any hug ever could. You look thinner, she said one gray morning in late April, standing at my cabin door with a basket on her hip. I'm working. You're starving is what you're doing. She pushed past me into the cabin, set the basket down hard enough to rattle the table. Eat something before you fall over in that tower and nobody finds you for a week. I laughed. First real laugh in longer than I wanted to admit. Except the laugh didn't last. Because Ida's face changed. Went serious in that fast way older women's faces do when they're about to say something they've been holding back. Draper's been asking around town, she said. My stomach dropped. Asking what? Asking about you. Asking about the property. Asking if anybody's seen inside that clearing. She crossed her arms. Whitesville's a small place, Ruthie. Word travels. What did they tell him? Nothing yet, but somebody will eventually. For the right price, somebody always does. She looked at me hard. You need to move faster than he does. Whatever your grandmother built up there, whatever it's worth, you need proof it's yours before he brings men with paper that says otherwise. I don't even know what proof looks like. Then you'd best start looking. I found the proof I wasn't looking for 2 weeks later. Except it wasn't the proof Ida meant. It was worse, and it was better. Both at once in that way things sometimes are. I'd been exploring the deeper parts of the tower past the main chamber, down a narrow passage my grandmother's journal mentioned only once in a single line. I'd read past a dozen times before it finally meant something. A back room, she'd written, for what must not be lost. The passage was blocked, not by rockfall, by something built stones, stacked, deliberate mortared, meant to look like collapse, but placed too carefully for it to be anything but a door disguised as a wall. It took me 2 days to clear it, and when I finally squeezed through into the space beyond my lantern light hit glass. Jar after jar after jar lined up on shelves carved into limestone, each one labeled in handwriting gone shaky with age, but still careful. Seeds, hundreds of jars, tomato seeds, bean seeds, corn, squash, names that didn't sound like anything from a seed catalog. Names that sounded like they belonged to people, not products. I picked one up, turned it in the lantern light. Cherokee Trail of Tears bean, from my mother's mother, 1889. My hands went cold holding that jar. Because I understood standing in that little stone room that this wasn't just a garden shed. This was something my grandmother had built with the same care, the same years of patience as the tower above it. A vault. An ark. Something meant to outlast her, outlast this hollow outlast, anybody who ever tried to dig it up and sell it. I found her journal in that room too, a separate one, smaller, older, and in it an entry that made my breath catch in my throat. They came in 1911, she'd written. Men from the county said the seeds my mother carried from her mother were not proper crops. Said they wanted good American seed in these hills. Not Cherokee seed, not seed that reminded people what this land was before men like them decided what it should become. They burned what they found in our garden that year. My mother wept for a week. I was 14. I swore that day I would build somewhere they could never find it again. Somewhere the vines themselves would stand guard. I sat down on that cold stone floor and I did not move for a long while. Because I understood then. Understood why the tower stood where it stood, hidden behind years of green. Understood why she let it grow shut instead of clearing a path to it herself. She wasn't hiding a farm. She was hiding a memory, a whole world of it. Everything men with matches and county paperwork had tried to burn out of these mountains, and she'd carried it jar by jar, seed by seed, into a stone room where time itself moved slower. I thought of Otis Draper's face in that doorway. Makes a man wonder what else your grandmother was hiding. He had no idea, and I decided sitting there in the cold and the dark with a jar of beans in my lap that he never would. Not from me, not ever. Summer came on slow and green. I sold what I could in Whitesville, oyster mushrooms, wrapped in cloth baskets, balanced on my hip for the long walk down. Most folks looked at me sideways. A girl selling cave mushrooms. Orphan girl at that. Word had gotten around, same as Ida warned. What's wrong with them, was the question I heard most. Nothing's wrong with them, I'd say. Try one. Nobody tried one. Not for weeks. Until a woman named Lucille Barton, thin-tired, 4 children and a husband overseas, bought a pound for 10 cents because it was cheaper than anything else on the street that day. Fried them in butter that night. Came back the following Saturday with her sister in tow. By August, I had a line. By September, Ida was helping me carry baskets, grumbling the whole 12 miles about her knees, and neither one of us said out loud what we both knew, that this hollow, this tower, this whole strange inheritance was starting to feed people who'd gone hungry a long time. I thought maybe, just maybe, things were turning. I was wrong. The fire came in October. Cold snap that week, first frost, already silvering the grass by morning. And I'd gone to bed early because my hands ached from cutting new logs all day. I woke to the smell of smoke. Not wood stove smoke. Wrong smoke. Sharp and wrong and close. I ran. Because there wasn't time to think. Wasn't time to reason it through. There was only the smell and my bare feet hitting frozen ground, and the orange light already climbing the tree line above the cabin, throwing shadows that moved wrong, that moved too fast, that moved like something alive and starving. The log yard. My log yard. Stacked cords of oak and poplar. I'd spent months cutting drying seasoning for the next round of logs. All of it. Catching all of it, roaring up into a sky gone black with smoke. And I stood there for one useless frozen second just staring. Then I grabbed the bucket, the only bucket, and I ran for the creek and I filled it, and I ran back and I threw water on flames that laughed at a single bucket the way flames do. It wasn't enough. It was never going to be enough. One girl, one bucket, a fire that size. I screamed. I don't remember what I screamed, just that it tore something in my throat and didn't slow the fire down even a little. And then lights coming up the path, lanterns bobbing and voices, and I turned expecting Draper's men come back to finish what the fire started. It wasn't Draper's men. It was Ida, running at nearly 70 years old, running up that dark path with a bucket of her own. Behind her, Lucille Barton and her sister and two men I recognized from Whitesville, who'd never once bought a mushroom from me, but showed up anyway, buckets in hand, because somebody had seen the smoke from town and word had traveled faster than the fire itself. "Move," Ida barked, shoving past me toward the creek. "Line up, bucket to bucket. Now, girl, now." We formed a line down to the water, passed buckets hand to hand in the dark and the cold and smoke that stung eyes and throats, and nobody talked because there wasn't breath to spare for talking. We fought that fire for 3 hours. We didn't save the whole yard. Half the logs went to ash before the flames finally choked out, smothered under enough creek water to drown a river. But half was saved. Half was still standing when the sun came up gray and cold over a hollow that smelled like char and wet ash, and underneath all of it, something else. Something that smelled almost like hope, if hope has a smell. I stood in the wreckage as the light came up. Soot streaked across my face, hands blistered raw from bucket rope. And I looked at the people around me, Ida and Lucille and her sister and two men who'd never spoken more than 10 words to me in my life. And something cracked open in my chest that had been closed since a dining hall in Charleston and a lawyer's letter nobody believed in. "Who did this?" I asked. My voice barely worked. Nobody answered right away. Then one of the men, Frank Coyle, I'd learn his name later, no relation to the girl who'd laughed loudest back at Sisters of Mercy's Small World in strange ways, spoke up. "Saw a truck leaving the bottom road round midnight," he said. "Didn't think nothing of it till I saw the smoke. Company truck. Same one's been asking round town. Draper." I didn't say the name out loud. Didn't need to. Everybody standing in that ash-streaked clearing already knew it. Ida found me an hour later sitting on a half-burned log staring at nothing. "You should be angry," she said. "I am angry." "Doesn't look like it." I looked up at her. "I'm thinking. About what? About how a man burns half a year's work in one night and thinks that'll make a 16-year-old girl give up a mountain." I stood. My legs shook, but I stood. "He doesn't know what's up in that tower, Ida. He doesn't know what he almost burned. The seeds. The seeds. And my grandmother's whole life's work. And now?" I looked around at the faces still standing in that clearing, waiting, unsure what came next. "Now half the county knows my name because they came running when they saw smoke. That's not nothing. That's not something Draper can burn." Ida's face did something complicated then. Something between pride and worry, the way a mother's face does when her child says something braver than she's ready to hear. "He'll come again," she said quietly. "Let him. Ruthie. Let him come, Ida." My voice didn't shake this time. "Because next time he won't find one girl alone in the dark. He'll find all of this." I gestured at the clearing, at the tower rising behind it, at the people who'd come running in the middle of the night for a girl most of them barely knew a few months ago. "And that's a fire he can't put out with paperwork." Word of the fire reached Whitesville by breakfast. By noon, half the town had heard some version of it. A coal company burning an orphan girl's cave farm, a story that grew wilder with every telling, though the truth needed no exaggerating. Mrs. Barton showed up that afternoon with more women behind her than I'd ever sold mushrooms to in a single week combined. "We're not letting that man run you off this hollow," she said, arms crossed, jaw set. "My husband's fighting overseas so men like Otis Draper can keep sitting safe at home burning girls' log yards. I won't stand for it. None of us will." Behind her murmurs of agreement, women who'd looked at me sideways in June now stood in my scorched clearing in October, sleeves rolled up, ready to rebuild. We rebuilt that log yard in 11 days. cut new timber, stacked it higher than before further from the tree line closer to the creek where water could reach it fast if fire ever came calling again. And through all of it, I kept thinking about my grandmother's words. The tower was never just stone, it was a promise. I understood now what she meant. Because a promise isn't just something you keep alone in the dark. Sometimes a promise is something a whole hollow decides to keep together once they understand what's worth keeping. Otis Draper came back in November. Not with fire this time, with men. 3 of them suits instead of work clothes and a folder of papers thick enough to make my stomach drop the second I saw it in his hand. He found me at the tower door, log yard rebuilt and smoking gently with the season's first cold snap, Ida at my side, the way she'd taken to standing most days now. Miss Sutton, that same easy voice, that same smile with teeth underneath it. Brought the paperwork I mentioned? Bring it inside a courtroom, I said. Not my front door. His smile flickered, just slightly. There won't need to be a courtroom if you're reasonable. Companies willing to make a fair offer. More money than a girl like you's ever gonna see any other way. A girl like me? You know what I mean. I don't think I do. His jaw tightened. The folder in his hand seemed to get heavier the way things do when a man realizes the easy road isn't going to be easy after all. There's a claim on this land, he said. Slower now, colder. Older than your grandmother's deed. My company's rights go back to 1904. You fight this, you'll lose, and you'll lose everything, not just the mineral rights, the whole hollow. I felt Ida go tense beside me, felt Lucille Barton, who'd walked up with a basket of something on her hip and stayed once she saw the trucks coming, go tense too. I thought about a journal entry, about a 14-year-old girl watching men burn her mother's garden, about years of vines grown thick enough to hide a cathedral, about a woman who built something so large, so patient, so deliberately hidden, that even a coal company with decades of paperwork couldn't have guessed what waited behind the green. I thought she didn't build all this just to lose it to a folder of papers. Mr. Draper? My voice came out steadier than I felt. My grandmother spent her whole life preparing for men exactly like you. If you think a folder is going to undo that, it's not just a folder, Miss Sutton. He stepped closer, voice dropping, losing its practiced ease. It's the law. Then I said you give me time to find out exactly what the law says. All of it, not just the parts your company likes. He studied me a long moment. Behind him, his men shifted, uncomfortable in a way that told me even they weren't entirely sure this was going in the direction they'd been promised. You've got 30 days, Draper said finally. Then this goes to court, whether you're ready or not. He turned, walked back to his truck, his men trailing after him like shadows that hadn't quite caught up yet. I watched them go, felt Ida's hand find my shoulder steady and warm despite the cold. 30 days, she said. 30 days to prove a mountain's worth more than a coal seam under it. It is more, I said. I just have to prove it fast enough for the law to believe me too. Behind us, deep inside that tower my grandmother built stone by stone across so many patient years, something waited. A vault of seeds nobody had ever burned. A truth she'd buried behind a wall built to look like collapse. Somewhere in those jars, in those journals, in that stubborn mountain of proof she'd left behind for a granddaughter she'd never met, I believed, standing in that cold clearing with 30 days on the clock, that the answer was already waiting. I just had to be brave enough and fast enough to go and find it. 30 days, that's what he gave me. 30 days to prove a mountain wasn't his. I spent the first 3 of them doing nothing but staring at jars. Because that's what panic does to a person. It doesn't make you move faster. It makes you freeze in front of the very thing that might save you hands-shaking mind, circling the same useless question over and over. Where? Where would she hide it? Where does a woman who buries seeds for decades also bury the one paper that matters most? I went through every journal again, all 6 of them this time, not just the ones I'd already read twice. Searched every margin. every pressed flower tucked between pages, every place a woman might slip something small and permanent into something she trusted nobody else to open. Nothing. Until the fourth day when I stopped looking at the journals and started looking at the tower itself. Because here's the thing about a building. A real building built stone by a woman who thought in decades instead of days. A building like that doesn't just hold what's inside it. It hides things in itself. I started at the base, ran my hands along every seam of mortar in that back chamber, the one with the seed jars, the one built to look like collapse until you knew better. Found nothing but cold stone and my own increasingly desperate breathing, which meant I moved on, which meant I climbed. The tower had a stair, spiral narrow cut straight into the thickness of the wall, and I hadn't dared climb it yet. Hadn't had reason to. Hadn't had 30 days ticking down in my chest, making every hour feel like it weighed a pound. I climbed it now. Lantern in one hand, the other trailing along cold stone, up past the main chamber, past shelves of pale mushrooms, glowing faint in lantern light, up into a part of the tower I hadn't touched. The bell chamber. Except there was no bell. There was an altar, small, stone, positioned right beneath where a bell should have hung, facing the rose window, so that whoever stood there caught the last of the day's light straight through colored glass gone cloudy with age. I stood in front of that altar and I felt something. Not a voice, not a sign from heaven, just a feeling. The kind you get standing somewhere a person meant for you to stand. I ran my hands along the stone, found a seam, small, barely visible, mortared and same as the false wall below, and my heart started going so hard I could feel it in my ears. I didn't have tools. I had my hands and a rusted trowel I'd carried up out of habit, in 30 days ticking down to 26, and I dug at that mortar until my fingers bled fresh on top of scars that hadn't fully healed from clearing vines 2 months earlier. The stone came loose. Behind it, a metal box, small, rusted at the corners, but sealed tight the way something gets sealed when a person means for it to survive longer than they will. I sat down right there on the cold floor of that bell chamber, colored light falling through the rose window across my hands, and I opened it. Papers. A deed dated 1935. Not to my grandmother, not to me. To a trust. A community trust, the paper called it, established for the preservation of this land and what grows upon it in perpetuity for the benefit of the people of this hollow and any who come seeking refuge here. I read it twice before it made sense. She hadn't just owned this land. She'd given it away, years before she died, given it to something bigger than herself, bigger than a granddaughter she'd never met, bigger than a coal company, with decades-old claims and a folder full of paperwork. Underneath the deed, a letter. Her handwriting, but younger, steadier, written long before the shaking started. If you are reading this, it means Draper or men like him have come again, and you have been brave enough to look further than the seeds and the mushrooms for what truly matters. This trust cannot be broken by any mining claim, however old. I made certain of that with a lawyer in Charleston who understood what I was protecting and why. The land is not mine to sell, and it was never his to claim. It belongs to what grows here. It always will. I sat in that bell chamber and I laughed. Then I cried. Then I did both at the same time, which is a strange thing to do alone in a stone tower, but grief and relief have never much cared about looking dignified. Because she'd known. Years before I was even born into an orphan's life in Charleston, she'd already been protecting me from a man I hadn't met yet, fighting a battle I didn't know was mine until 30 days ago. I held that deed against my chest the way you'd hold something that just saved your life, because it had. Hargrove read every page twice before he looked up at me across his cluttered desk in Whitesville. "This is airtight," he said. Quiet, almost reverent. Whoever drew this up in 35 knew exactly what they were doing. Draper's claim doesn't matter a lick against a properly filed trust. It predates his most recent filing by 4 years at least. Maybe more once we dig through the county records properly. So we win. So you win. He set the papers down carefully like they might bruise. Assuming the court agrees the trust was legally established, which he tapped the seal at the bottom. Given this notary stamp, I don't see how they couldn't. I should have felt only relief. I did feel relief. But underneath it, something else. Something that had been building since that fire, since Ida ran up a dark path at nearly 70 years old with a bucket in her hand, since Lucille Barton showed up with half of Whitesville's women behind her, ready to rebuild what one man tried to burn down. I felt something that didn't have a name yet. Not until 3 days later when a stranger walked up my hollow with a duffel bag over one shoulder and a limp he was trying too hard to hide. His name was Daniel Boyd. He'd been overseas, he told me later, until a wound to his leg sent him home earlier than the rest of his unit discharged that same spring, while the war overseas was still grinding on without him, a fact that seemed to sit uneasy in his chest, like a man ashamed of the very thing that saved his life. He came back to Boone County quieter than he'd left, carrying things in his eyes that didn't have names either. He'd heard about the tower. Everybody had by then, the fire, the trial looming, the girl who'd turned a coal company's claim into a losing hand. He came up the path not looking for a story, though. He came up looking for work, he said. Said he'd studied some agriculture before the war took him overseas. Said he'd heard a place like this might need an extra pair of hands. I looked at him, standing in my clearing duffel bag, tired eyes, boots that had walked a lot further than West Virginia and back. "You know anything about mushrooms?" I asked. "No, ma'am." "Seeds a little?" "Rebuilding a log yard that got burned down by a man who still might win a lawsuit against me." Something shifted in his face then. Not fear. Something closer to recognition. "I know how to rebuild things," he said. "Spent the last while watching things get torn down overseas. Figure I owe the world some building back." I didn't say anything for a moment. Then I handed him an axe. He didn't ask about the trial. Not for the first week. Just worked cutting logs, hauling substrate, learning faster than any hand I'd trained yet. And in the evenings, he'd sit at my grandmother's table and read her journals with a kind of careful attention that made something in my chest go soft and unguarded, whether I wanted it to or not. "She was remarkable," he said one night. Quiet, not looking up from the page. "She was stubborn." Same thing sometimes. I laughed. First time I'd laughed easy and longer than I could remember. "You're stubborn too," he added, still not looking up. "How would you know that?" "Because you're sitting across from a man you met a week ago, teaching him to run a mushroom farm inside a stone church while fighting a coal company for the right to keep doing it." Now he looked up. Something steady in his eyes. Something that had survived a war and come out the other side, still gentle. "Takes a particular kind of stubborn to do all that without breaking." My grandmother's word for it. Particular. Good word. I felt my face go warm. Looked back down at my own book so he wouldn't see it. Except he already had. The trial came faster than 30 days should have allowed, though every single one of those days had felt like a year. Otis Draper sat at one table with his lawyers, in his folder of paperwork gone thin with overuse. I sat at the other with Hargrove, and behind me, filling nearly every bench in that little Boone County courthouse, sat the whole hollow. Ida, Lucille Barton and her sister, Frank Coyle, Daniel in the back hat in his hands. Draper's lawyer stood first, talked for 20 minutes about mineral rights and 1904 filings and legal precedent that made my stomach drop lower with every sentence. Then Hargrove stood. He didn't talk for 20 minutes. He held up one paper. A deed dated 1935, sealed and notarized and airtight in every way that mattered. This land, he said, was placed in irrevocable trust years before Mr. Draper's company filed their most recent claim. A trust cannot be undone by a mineral lease, however old, filed against land the seller no longer owned outright to lease. He set the paper down. Mabel Kincaid gave this hollow away before any of us in this room knew her granddaughter's name. She gave it to something bigger than herself. The court can't undo a gift. The judge read the deed twice. The courtroom held its breath the way you hold your breath watching something you desperately need to go right. Then he set it down and he said the words I'd been afraid to let myself hope for. The trust stands. Mr. Draper's claim is dismissed. The courtroom didn't erupt. Not right away. There was a moment, one whole breath, where nobody quite believed it yet. Then Ida stood up first, started clapping alone in a courtroom that wasn't supposed to allow it, and the bailiff didn't stop her, and one by one the whole hollow rose up behind her until the sound of it filled that little room like something finally exhaling. I turned, found Daniel in the back row, standing with everyone else, and he wasn't clapping. He was just looking at me, like he'd known all along how this was going to end. Otis Draper caught me outside the courthouse steps alone, his folder gone from his hand, now nothing left to hide behind. "You got lucky," he said, quiet, bitter. "My grandmother got smart," I said, "years before I was even born. That's not luck, Mr. Draper. That's a woman who understood exactly what men like you were capable of and built something you couldn't reach." He didn't have an answer for that. He turned, walked to his truck one last time, and this time when the engine started, it sounded like something ending instead of something coming for me. I stood on those courthouse steps and let myself breathe for the first time in 30 days. Dr. Eleanor Voss arrived from Marshall University 2 weeks after the trial, having heard rumors of a seed collection unlike anything documented east of the Mississippi. She walked through that back chamber with tears running openly down her face, picking up jar after jar with hands that shook with something closer to reverence than curiosity. "Do you understand what you have here?" she asked, holding up a jar labeled in my grandmother's careful hand. "Some of these varieties were believed extinct, gone, lost to history." She looked at me. "Your grandmother didn't just save seeds, Miss Sutton. She saved a piece of who this land used to belong to before anybody tried to erase it." "She saved a lot of things," I said. "She just needed someone to plant them." By the following autumn, Dr. Voss and I had cataloged 200 distinct varieties. Beans and corn and squash traced back to Cherokee farming traditions, generations deep seeds that had survived fires and coal companies, and decades of a world that wanted this land to grow. Only one thing dug up and sold and forgotten. Dr. Voss connected me with the State Agricultural Service, with university seed banks eager to preserve what nearly wasn't. And every single person who walked through that back chamber, saw those jars, understood what quiet defiance had protected. Every one of them went quiet the same way. Not the quiet of embarrassment, the quiet of awe. Daniel and I married the following autumn on the terraces we'd cleared above the tower. Cherokee purple tomato vines climbing trellises behind us. Ida standing witness with tears she'd denied to her dying day. Lucille Barton brought a cake made from flour she'd rationed carefully for weeks. And half of Whitesville came up that hollow road to see a girl they'd once looked at sideways stand in front of a stone church and promise herself to a quiet man with a gentle limp. There wasn't much money for a wedding. There didn't need to be. We had terraces full of squash blossoms and jars of honey and a whole hollow of people who'd fought a fire together, and that was worth more than any church in Charleston could have offered. Our first child came the following spring, a daughter. We named her Mabel after the woman who'd built a cathedral in a mountain and waited 30 years for somebody to come find it. Daniel held her on the porch of that cabin the first night, and I watched him look at her the way he sometimes looked at the tower, like something too large and too good to have simply appeared in his life without cost. "She's going to grow up knowing every inch of that place," he said quietly. "She's going to grow up loving it the way we do," I said, "whether she wants to or not." He laughed at that, soft, tired, happy in the particular way a man is happy after years of not knowing if happiness was still something the world owed him. 2 more children followed in the years after. A boy we named after Daniel's own father, lost early in the war before Daniel ever shipped out himself. And a second daughter, small and stubborn from the day she was born, who took to the tower before she could properly walk, crawling toward the mushroom shelves like she already understood what waited there. Every one of them learned to read a mushroom log and save a seed before they ever learned their letters in school. Every one of them grew up hearing the story of a tower hidden behind vines, told and retold at the supper table, until it stopped being my story and started being theirs too. Daniel expanded the mushroom operation those first years of marriage building. New shelves, new frames, teaching himself the carpentry. The tower demanded the same patient way he'd once taught himself to survive a war. We began supplying restaurants in Charleston, then Huntington dried mushrooms packed and shipped by mail to families who'd never once set foot in West Virginia, but wrote back letters full of gratitude anyway. We trained other families in the county too, showed them how to cut logs, how to inoculate, how to coax a harvest out of ground most people had given up on. Because that was the other thing my grandmother taught me, tucked into the margins of her journals, if you read closely enough. Abundance isn't worth much if you keep it only for yourself. Ida lived to see all of it. The trial, the wedding, 3 grandchildren, though they weren't hers, by blood running up and down terraces she'd helped clear with her own 2 hands. She'd sit on my porch some evenings, watching my children chase chickens through the yard, and she'd say the same thing every time, like a woman testing whether a truth still held up under repetition. Your grandmother would be proud, Ruthie, prouder than she ever let herself be out loud, most likely. She wasn't much for saying things plain, but she'd be proud. Ida died in 1953, 80 years old, on a bright October morning, sitting in her own rocking chair with a cup of coffee going cold beside her. I buried her on the hillside above the cabin, where she could see every terrace she'd fought to protect, every row of Cherokee purple tomatoes she'd once declared the best thing she ever tasted. I planted a fresh row on her grave that same week because I wanted her tasting them forever, and because some promises are easier kept in dirt than in words. The tower kept growing through all of it. By the early 60s, the seed collection had passed 400 varieties cataloged now, with proper university backing requested by researchers from as far as Washington. The mushroom operation had grown large enough that Daniel hired 2 men from Whitesville, full-time men, who'd once looked at me sideways buying a pound of oyster mushrooms for 10 cents and now called me Mrs. Boyd with something like real respect in their voices. My children grew alongside all of it. Mabel, my eldest, took to the seed vault the way I once had, patient, careful, endlessly curious about why one variety thrived where another failed. My son grew into a steady, quiet young man, much like his father, better with his hands than his words, content to spend whole days repairing shelves and frames without complaint. My youngest daughter grew the most like Ida, if I'm honest, sharp-tongued, unafraid of hard work, the first to raise her voice when something needed defending. Daniel died gently in the autumn of 1979. The way good men seem to choose autumn, sitting on our porch with the sound of the creek below and soup still warm on the stove inside. He'd been quieter those last few years, slower, the old leg wound from the war finally catching up with the rest of him, but he never once complained, not in all the years I knew him. I held his hand as the light went out of that porch, as the sun set gold over terraces we'd built together, out of nothing but stubbornness in seed jars, in a tower nobody believed could hold what it held. I buried him beside Ida on that same hillside, close enough that I like to imagine the 2 of them keeping each other company through the long seasons, the way they'd both once kept me company through mine. My children were grown by then, though they never left the hollow entirely. Mabel took over most of the seed vault's daily care. My son managed the mushroom operation alongside the 2 hired men, now gray-haired themselves. My youngest daughter went off to study agriculture at Marshall University, the same school Dr. Voss had come from all those years before, determined to bring even more science back to a place that had always run equally on faith and stubbornness. I kept tending the tower myself every single morning, checking the temperature and the humidity and the logs the way my grandmother must have checked them for years before I ever knew her name. Talking to the mycelium the way you talk to something that's kept a promise longer than most people manage in a lifetime. Some mornings my grandchildren would follow me up that spiral stair, small hands trailing along the same cold stone my own hands had once bled against, asking question after question about mushrooms and seeds, and a woman none of them had ever met, but somehow already loved. I told them all of it. The dining hall in Charleston, the laughing girls, the lawyer with tobacco-stained fingers, the vines and the cold breath behind them, and the tower rising up out of a hillside like the mountain itself had been holding its breath for years. I told them about the fire and about Ida running up that dark path at nearly 70 with a bucket in her hand. I told them about their grandfather coming up that same path years later with a duffel bag and a limp in a gentleness that had survived a war intact. I told them more than anything that none of it had been luck, that every single piece of it had been built by patient, stubborn hands, refusing to let something good be forgotten. I died in that tower in the spring of 1986, 60 years old, found sitting against the cold stone wall of the back chamber with a jar in my lap. Cherokee Trail of Tears beans, the very first jar I ever opened all those years ago in a stone room I found behind a wall built to look like collapse. My granddaughter said I looked peaceful. My son said I looked like I was finally home. The tower still stands, recognized now as a historic site, protected the same way my grandmother once protected it. Not with a shotgun this time, but with a trust nobody can undo, exactly the way she always intended. The seed bank holds over 600 varieties tended now by my granddaughter and a small staff who understand the way I came to understand that some things are worth years of patient, invisible work. Every March, families come from across the state for the Kincaid Heritage Seed Festival, held right there on the terraces above the hollow, trading seeds and swapping stories and planting things that should have been lost but weren't, because one woman had the foresight to save them, and another had the stubbornness to clear the vines and find them. Above the tower door where my grandmother carved her name in 1912, my children added a second line years after I was gone. She cleared the way. So let me ask you something before this story ends and you go on with your evening. What's standing behind the vines in your own life? What's overgrown that you've been walking past, assuming there's nothing worth the effort of clearing? Because here's what all those years of tending that tower taught me, and what I hope this story leaves with you tonight. The most valuable things are almost always hidden, not because they're small, not because they don't matter, but because the world grows over them and neglect covers them, and most people walk past because clearing the vines is hard, thankless work that nobody claps for until they finally see what's standing underneath. My grandmother spent her whole life building something extraordinary inside a mountain, and then she let the forest seal it shut, and she trusted that somebody someday would be brave enough to open it again. She was right. Not because I was anybody special, because I was desperate enough to try and patient enough to keep going, even when a man with a folder full of paperwork tried to convince me it wasn't worth the fight. Your vines are not the obstacle. They never were. They're the test. And whatever's waiting behind them, whatever you've been too afraid or too tired or too convinced isn't there to go looking for, it's always worth the work of clearing.